Welcome to Rambam in Depth. Today we'll be discussing the Rambam Hilchos Ma'aser HaKarbanos Perek Daled Halacha Aleph. The Rambam says as follows: Kol HaKarbanos ein makriven eisem el b'yom. All sacrifices can only be offered by day. And what's the proof for that? Shenemar b'yom tzavosei es b'nei Yisrael lahakriv karbaneim. On the day that he commanded the Bnei Yisrael to bring their offerings. The word b'yom teaches you b'yom v'lo b'layla. You can't bring it at night. L'fichach ein sheichetin zvachim ela b'yom. So now we know that you cannot slaughter or sacrifice except by day. That's about the shchita. Now there's a separate halacha about the zrikas hadam, the sprinkling of the blood. And the Rambam continues, Be'ein zarkim damim ela b'yom hashchita. You can only sprinkle the blood on the day of the shchita. Shenemar, because it says in another pasuk, B'yom hakrivaya zivchai, and the day that you offer the zevach, your sacrifice. So that teaches you, B'yom hazvicha, the day in which you can offer a sacrifice, Tia hakrava, then you can bring the offering, which is the sprinkling of the blood. B'kiban sheshaka hachama nifsal hadam. Once the sun sets, the blood becomes invalidated. So here the question is, why do we need two psukim? This is a question asked by Tosafot in Zvachim Daf Nun Vav Amud Aleph. Why we need two separate psukim? One pasuk tells you can't bring an offering by day, which means that you have to bring the whole sacrifice by day. So you would know that if you brought it at night, if you sprinkle the blood at night, it would become invalidated. Why? Because you can only bring the carbon by day, and if you leave it overnight to the next day, it becomes invalid anyhow. Like any other part of the sacrifice, it becomes nicer, left over beyond the prescribed time. So why do you need a second pasuk? So Rashi in Zvachim there anticipated this question, Tosafot says, and the Rashi says that it goes according to the one who says that if you left the sacrifice on the Mizbeach overnight, it doesn't become invalidated. So according to that opinion, you need a second pasuk to tell you that that doesn't apply to the blood. The blood does become invalidated immediately with Shkiyas Achama. That's the answer that Rashi gives. But Tosafot asks, but there's another opinion. How do you answer the question according to the other opinion that says that you cannot leave the blood on the Mizbeach? You can't leave anything on the Mizbeach overnight to allow you to use it the next day. And if that's the case, you already know from the first pasuk that the sacrifice can only be brought by day, and if you leave it over, it becomes invalidated. You can't sprinkle at night. You have to leave it to the next day, and the next day it's automatically invalidated. And secondly, the Rambam certainly cannot answer the question the way Rashi does, because the Rambam paskins like the opinion that says that you cannot leave things on the Mizbeach overnight and make them acceptable for the next day, and therefore there's no need for a second pasuk. So the Sefer Derech HaKodesh from Rabbi Amiel, who was a chief rabbi of Tel Aviv, gives the following answer. He says, when it comes to sacrifices that become invalid, there are two standards. There's a standard of psulei begufay, when there's an intrinsic invalidation. Let's say something happens to the sacrifice itself, it becomes tameh, it was taken out of the Beis Hamikdash area, which invalidates it. That's considered an intrinsic invalidation. Then you burn it right away. But if it's an extrinsic, an external invalidation, let's say the person who brings the sacrifice becomes tameh, so he can't bring it, but it's nothing to do with the sacrifice itself, then you're not allowed to burn it right away. You have to wait to uber tzarasan, when the form of the sacrifice is no longer intact, when it becomes nicer, and then, which is an intrinsic invalidation, then you could burn it. The same thing, Rabbi Amiel argues, and he brings proof, it would apply to blood as well. When blood becomes invalid, you're supposed to pour it out in the stream in the Beis Hamikdash. But that's only if there's an intrinsic invalidation. If it's invalid because something happened to the actions of the one who brought the sacrifice, who sprinkled the blood, but not the actual blood itself, then you have to wait. You have to make sure that it becomes totally invalid. It becomes nicer in order for you to discard it. So therefore, Rabbi Amiel argues that the reason why you need a second pasuk, because if you would have only the first pasuk, that you have to bring a sacrifice by day, and therefore you can't use it at night, and it becomes invalid the next day, you couldn't pour out the blood right away because there's nothing invalid about the blood. It's just that the person has a restriction that he's not allowed to offer it after sunset. So that's not an invalidation of the blood itself. Therefore, you cannot discard it right away. It would be improper. You have to wait until it becomes nicer the next morning. But now that we have a separate pasuk that the dam itself is invalidated after sunset, that tells you that there's an intrinsic problem with the blood, and therefore you have to pour it out right away. You don't have to wait until it becomes nicer. Then he gives a second similar answer, but a little bit of a different twist. And he says that what would happen if the person sprinkles the blood before sunset, but the blood doesn't reach the Mizbeach until after sunset. If you wouldn't have a separate pasuk to invalidate the blood, the only invalidation would be because the person who brought it didn't bring it in the right time. But there's nothing wrong with the blood. The blood itself is fine. So the only problem is the person who sprinkled the blood. But he sprinkled it before sunset, so there's no problem. But if you say that there's something about the blood itself becomes disqualified. The blood didn't reach the Mizbeach until after sunset, and therefore it would be invalidated. Tosafot himself gives a different answer. Tosafot's answer is that the pasuk, the second pasuk to tell you that dam is nipsal, becomes invalidated with shkiyas hachama, doesn't mean the end of shkiyas hachama. Tzeisik hachavim, when the stars come out, it means the beginning, just when the sun sets. So it's still considered day, and even though it's still considered day, nevertheless, it's invalid. That's the chiddush you wouldn't know from the first pasuk. There it would only be if it's during the day. But here it is during the day and it still becomes invalid. But the Rambam doesn't hint to that explanation, and therefore we have to explain the Rambam the way we just explained it before.